In this exercise, you can learn to build custom checkbox and radio button interfaces in order to gain full control over their design and functionality without requiring a ridiculous amount of CSS code, CSS hacks, or third-party frameworks. We're going to use just a few lines of CSS to set their appearance and just a few lines of JavaScript to establish their functionality. Some of the benefits of building your own custom components are that you achieve consistent design across all browsers. And another benefit is that malicious bots and foul automated programs won't be able to recognize and interact with your components as easily as they do stock components. So you can fire up your favorite code editor and create a file called checkbox.html to run your experiments in. The first thing we're going to do is set up a div, because div is an all-purpose element in HTML. It has no specific semantic value, so you can use a div for pretty much anything you want, and divs are made for general purpose use, and there's really no other elements that have that description, so no other elements would be more appropriate really. And the first thing we'll do is give the div a class equal to CB. Then we'll go ahead and give it an ID equal to CB1, and each ID needs to be unique throughout all of your elements in your document. And you can use this ID to target this specific checkbox through JavaScript, and if you want to pass the value for the checkbox through Ajax to a server-side language. Then we're going to set up a custom data attribute, which will be data-checked. And we're going to set it equal to 0 by default. That means this checkbox won't be checked by default. And 0 is equal to false. 1 is equal to true. And then finally, we're going to put an onClick event that's equal to a function that we're going to put in our JavaScript called toggleCB, which is short for toggle checkbox. And we're going to pass this as an argument through that function. That way we get dynamic access to this div when this function fires off. The keyword this represents the object that it's within. Okay, so I've changed everything for CB2 to be an independent checkbox. So you have CB1, CB2, and your events don't have to be directly set inside of your HTML element. This can be set through add event listener using JavaScript in the onLoad event or the load event of the document. That's just in case you wanted to remove any event handling from your HTML elements directly. You can target CB1 and CB2 and then add event listeners through JavaScript when the page loads. Or you can just put it directly in the element, and it works exactly the same. Now under those, I'm going to add a button element that when clicked is going to run a function called submit values. And let's go ahead and just put that function in place while we're thinking about it. So here's function submit values, and all we're going to do is alert ourselves the values for the dataset.checked, and that will return or show either 0 or 1 depending on whether the checkbox is checked or not. And this is how you can access your values for those checkboxes in JavaScript, or when you want to pass this information or this data through Ajax to a server-side language like PHP. And also keep in mind that your scripting, your JavaScript, doesn't even have to be in the document. You can externalize this JavaScript into any external JavaScript files that you're applying to your document. So just because I have it directly in my document for this tutorial's sake doesn't mean that you have to set up your application that way. Most of the times we like to externalize our JavaScript and our CSS code. But if this is the only document that's going to use this specific JavaScript, then there's no need to externalize it at all. You really only need to externalize JavaScript when multiple documents are going to reuse that same exact code. If only one document is going to use a certain script or CSS code, it makes more sense to have it directly in that one specific document and not externalize it. Now, if we were to take a look at this in our favorite browser, you're not going to see any checkboxes yet because we haven't applied the little bit of CSS to design those divs to make them look and act like a checkbox. And right now they're block level display items with nothing in them, so that's why you can't see them. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of CSS to the document that's going to style those checkboxes. And then we can refresh, and now we see we have checkboxes. And the CSS is very lightweight and easy to comprehend. We have display. We're taking the divs out of their normal block display behavior and making them inline block, because that's how a checkbox or radio button would behave, making the width 12 pixels, the height 12 pixels to make them a little square. The background color is going to be a light gray. The border is going to be a little bit of a darker gray, 1 pixel solid. The border radius is going to be 1 pixel. And if you wanted to turn these into radio buttons, you would just put this on border radius 100%. And that'll make a little circle. And I have a transition set here. That way when it changes from gray to green or from unchecked to checked, it'll have an animated effect when those colors change. And then cursor is set to pointer, just so our cursor changes whenever we hover over the checkbox. Now the last little bit of code we need is this function toggle CB to be put into our script section. And here it is. So when function toggle CB fires off, it's intaking as an argument the div or the checkbox as an object. So we have reference to whichever checkbox is being checked at that moment. That way we can do anything we want to it when it is interacted with. So the first thing we do is set up an if-else condition statement, and that reads if the checkbox .dataset.checked, which is this attribute here, is equal to 0, then we're going to change it to the green style. First, let me show you what it looks, how everything functions. And that's all the code. There's not going to be any more code we're going to add to this little demo. So let me refresh, and then I'm going to click checkbox 1, checkbox 2, unclick or uncheck them. And then when I press submit, we see CB1 is equal to 0 and CB2 is equal to 1. 0 being false, 1 being true. If I have them both checked, then they'll say CB1 equals 1, CB2 equals 1. So they're both checked, and our script would have an indication that they're both checked. So now you see how it actually works. I'll finish explaining every line of this function. So if checkbox.dataset.checked is equal to 0, which they are by default, then we're going to change the background color to the color that we desire it to be when it's in its checked mode. And then we're going to change its dataset attribute.checked to 1. Now the next time that checkbox is interacted with, we have to change it back to being unchecked. So if cb.dataset.checked is equal to 1, then this else condition is going to fire off, and we'll change it back to light gray, and its dataset.checked back to 0. And it's that simple. So if we submit without interacting with them, they're both going to be false or not checked. If we change 1 to checked, then CB1 equals 1 and CB2 equals 0. Now there are things you can do to the design if you want to enhance it, to put HTML entities within the box, the checkbox, so that it actually shows a check mark, because there's an HTML entity for check marks. Or you can use PNG images, or you can use SVG graphics. That's only if you want. You don't have to. Now I would warn you against using HTML entities, because browsers do the same sort of thing. From one browser to the next, they're going to show those HTML entities differently. There'll be a different design between different browsers for HTML entities. So that's just a little warning. If you're going to use HTML entities, just realize that it's going to look different from one browser to the next. The check marks won't look exactly the same in every single browser. and they might be sized differently. So that's why I would suggest using PNG graphics or SVG graphics if you must have a check show up in that checkbox. And like I mentioned before, if I want to change this border radius to 100%, then basically I will have radio buttons instead of checkboxes, because radio buttons and checkboxes have very similar functionality in your applications. Let's put that back the way it was. Now I put together some other examples in case you guys can't figure out how to achieve the exact functionality you want to mimic the way actual checkboxes and radio buttons function in an application. So we have here checkbox grouped, and the code changes just a little bit. Checkbox in form submission scenario. That's only if you're not going to be submitting your form through Ajax. If you're going to use a traditional form posting without using Ajax, then this is the type of change to the code that you can make to where whenever the checkbox is interacted with, then you can just have a hidden input that would take on the value of whatever data.checked is. And you do that through JavaScript. And then we have checkbox prefilled and checkbox with click text. Because a lot of the times you'll notice that there's the label, the actual visible text next to the checkbox or radio button is interactive, where when the user clicks on that text, it highlights the checkbox or the radio button, or it makes the radio button or checkbox become checked or unchecked when the user interacts with the label text. So let's go ahead and just get all of these in the browser so you can see the different way they work, and then I'll explain them a little bit. Okay, here we have the original one that we first created, and this would be just for the most basic functionality. Actually, let me go ahead and refresh that, get it back to a checkbox. This would be the most basic functionality that you would have or need for using checkboxes and radio buttons. And you already saw the code for this one, so you know how that works. Now this one is checkbox grouped, because a lot of times you'll want to have a checkbox group or a radio button group. So what'll happen is when you click those, you can't click multiple in the group, only one. So that's what grouping them does. Only one of them can be selected within that group. And I'm going to show you the code for that. It's very simple to do, and we use an array. Another variation to the functionality might be checkbox in form submission scenario. So if you keep an eye on this URL up here, when I click CB1 and then press submit, it processes the form in a traditional sense, to where if you're not using Ajax, but most professionals build their forms nowadays with Ajax handling all the data transmission to the server-side language like PHP. So 99% of the time in 2017 onward, you're going to see Ajax handling all form submissions. The data from forms is not being transmitted much anymore using the traditional approach. So what I did was I set my form to get, that way you can see the values being passed in the URL. But usually you would post these values and not use the get method. You would use post method. I just used get method so you can actually see the values in the URL. So if I have both of them checked and I submit, then you can see CB hider input is 1 and the CB hider 2 is also equal to 1 because they were both checked when I submit the form. If I only highlight or check CB2 then submit, you'll see CB1 is equal to 0 and CB2 is equal to 1. So that's what would be passed, and I'll show you the code for how this all works. And then we have checkbox prefilled. So you can see when the page loads, CB2 is prefilled and checked already. And that would be in the scenario where you just want to have a checkbox that is already checked when the page loads. And then the final variation will be checkbox with click text. That was the interactive text, to where when the user clicks on that text label, it checks and unchecks the checkbox. That would be similar to using the label element with a stock checkbox. Okay? So you can either click the text or the checkbox itself. Let's first take a look at the variation of checkbox with click text. Now all I did to make that possible was I wrapped my checkbox div, my custom checkbox, in a span element along with the label text that I want that will be interactive. Now instead of the actual div having the toggle checkbox function in its onClick event, we're going to add the onClick event in the span instead of the div. That way anything within this span becomes an interactive part of checking and unchecking that checkbox. And you can see instead of using just this, I'm saying this.children with a 0 index. Now what that does is it passes this div, which is the first child of this span element, it passes that object through this toggle CB function because we want this checkbox to be the object that this function handles and not the span element. And that's the only variation to the code to make that possible. Now checkbox prefilled, let's check out that variation. Our CSS is exactly the same except we've added a CB_checked CSS rule. And all that does is make sure that the background will be green by default when the page loads. JavaScript is exactly the same. And then what you would do is put the class CB. Normally you would have just class CB, but the one that you want to have checked, or any amount of checkboxes that you want to have checked, you're going to also give them the class of CB checked. So it gets the class CB so that this CSS rule is applied to it. And then we give it CB checked as well, so this CSS rule applies to it, which will make its background green. And then we make sure we set its data checked attribute to 1 instead of 0 because it is checked by default when the page loads. And that's the only variation there. Now let's check out checkbox grouped. Now our HTML is pretty much exactly the same as it was before for grouping the checkboxes, except we're going to add a new class called CB or checkbox group 1. And you can see that's not in our CSS. That class is added so that we can group all of these checkboxes together and have them as an array in our JavaScript. So we're not adding this class to target through CSS. We're adding this class only so that we can make an array out of this div, and this div. So when our toggle CB function runs, we create a variable called CB array, and that's going to be equal to document.getElementsByClassName checkbox group 1, which is down here in its class attribute. Then we can run a for loop over that array of checkboxes to make them all turn gray and be unchecked. Then we run our normal if-else condition that we had in the original here. You see? So it's very easy to group them all together, and you can have 50 checkboxes there if you want that are grouped. But what happens is each time toggle CB function runs, you just basically want to change all of your checkboxes in that group back to unchecked, and then this code here takes the whole array and makes them unchecked, and then this code here would check only the specific one that's being interacted with by the user. It checks or unchecks it, just like in the original code. Then finally, let's take a look at the checkbox in the form submission scenario. So all I did here, CSS stays exactly the same. The toggle CB function stays exactly the same, except we're adding one line of code to it. We want to take the checkbox's previous element sibling value and make it equal to whatever the checkbox data set is for the checked, the data checked attribute. So basically what's happening is when toggle CB runs, these hidden inputs are going to receive the value of its next element sibling. So when this checkbox is interacted with by the user, this hidden input is going to receive the value of its data checked attribute. And that way you can pass this information or this data, whether the checkbox is checked or not, to a server-side language in a traditional form data transmission scenario. But like I said, most forms that are professionally built in 2017 are going to pass the data to a server-side language using AJAX. But if you have to use traditional form method, then you can use this kind of trick to pass CB hider 1 and CB hider 2, and that will represent those checkboxes, the value whether it's checked or not. When PHP or your server-side language gets a hold of that data, it'll know which checkboxes were checked or not. I'll see you next time. Bye.